Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the symposium on innateness, universals, and diversity. I'm Berent. I'm the organizer of this symposium. And here are some burning questions for us. Is the mind equipped with universal biases? If so, how to account for the undeniable diversity of human cognition? If universal biases do exist, then what is their source? Do they arise from domain general systems or from core knowledge, domain-specific biases? Finally, how can we, cognitive scientists, get to human nature? How can we minimize our intuitive biases and expand our limited weird perspective? So in the symposium, we'll try to address those challenges from an interdisciplinary perspective. Richard Samuels, the philosopher in the group, will start by discussing the notion of innateness and human nature. I'll talk about whether we can get human nature right. Jennifer Culbertson will talk about a diverse approach to language universals, and Asifa Majid will talk about how we reconcile nature and culture in the domain of perception. So in so doing, our goals here is to both highlight the gains that we have acquired and the limits of our current understanding of innateness and domain specificity, highlight the value of exploring human diversity, and consider the challenges that face us, humans, in grasping our own human nature. Thank you very much for being here, and I move the talk to Richard, who will start. If I can have the screen again, please. So I will follow. Excellent. So I am not talking about scientists now. I am talking about lay people. And people have always wondered about human nature, right? But our curiosity is kind of targeted, right? Because people rarely tend to think about why we have two hands rather than wings. Rather, it's knowledge, it's beliefs, it's our epistemic states that get our curiosity. And when we start looking at innate knowledge, things get really interesting really quickly. And the question is why? Why is innateness such a hard question? Now, I don't think that the problem is in the question, although this is something that we can discuss. And instead, I'm asking, could it be in the questionnaire? Could our troubles with innateness arise from within the human inquirer? And what I'll try to convince you today is that people are systematically blind to innate knowledge. And furthermore, that the blindness arises by design. It arises from the very principles that make the mind tick and are probably innate. Now, from the way of putting the questions, I probably get some people unhappy because, and you might say correctly, how can we charge people of biases when scientists still don't know whether human nature exists, right? So I'm going to try to bypass the problems from two strategies. And the first is to focus on the facts, right? So scientists disagree about why people behave the way they do, but they do agree on how people behave in certain situations and say what newborns can do. So the question is, can lay people reason about those facts correctly? More importantly, what is the logic that drives those inferences, and is the logic sound? So starting in the first strategy, one thing that we try to do in the lab is invite people to play scientists and ask them to predict how will newborns behave, right? So we provided them with detailed descriptions of experiments that have been done, complete with the rationale and method, and asked them to predict how will infants respond in these situations. The advantage here is that we know how infants actually respond, and the logic is that if people really believe that those traits are innate, then they could, they don't must, but they could emerge at birth. So what do people do? Here is an example, a simplified version of the Izard experiment on number cognition, where we want to know whether infants have an abstract notion of numbers, so they're presented with a certain number of sounds and a certain number of lights, so that the number is either congruent, so 4 and 4, or incongruent, 4 and 2. And we tell our participants, here is the rationale, right? If newborns have an abstract sense of number, then when the number is congruent, they should look longer in the screen. So tell us, will they look longer, yes or no? Simple question. In the same way, we ask them, do newborn infants prefer syllables like blog to blog? Do they prefer helpers to hinderers? All these experiments have been done. 2 of those have been done with newborns, and we know the answers. Yes, infants do all those things. But when we ask lay people, that tell us, no way, right? Now, it's not the case that people deny all forms of innateness. So when we ask them, what about facial emotions? Will newborns prefer happy faces to angry faces? And here, actually, newborns can't do that, but people tell you, sure they do. So to give you a sense of the data, on 80% of the time, people tell you that emotions, that infants can recognize happy faces and distinguish them from angry faces, but none of the epistemic cases elicit the same responses. And in fact, for number and moral cognition, people say, no, this is not innate. So our empiricist intuitions are targeted. It's innate knowledge that people deny, whereas innate emotions are perfectly fine. And you pretty much get the same answer when you use a different situation. So you ask people to reason about a desert island situation. So if you took a group of infants, raised them together without an opportunity to observe a certain trait in others, take care of them, right? Not abuse them, but then you ask, will their trait emerge spontaneously? Half of the traits are epistemic, traits that have been observed across cultures. We don't know if they're innate, but it's not implausible that they are, like having a concept of person, keeping track of time. The other half are emotions and motor skills, like love, fear, squatting, and lifting. And when we ask people, will those traits emerge? They're saying that epistemic traits are significantly less likely to emerge. And when we ask them a forced choice, now it's very clear they're saying epistemic traits are not innate, significantly below chance, whereas for non-epistemic traits are telling you, sure, these will emerge. So again, our intuitions about innateness are targeted. It's knowledge that people deny, innate knowledge, whereas for non-epistemic traits, that's fine. And it's actually not only I who claim that. So as we published that paper, Jenny Wang and Lisa Fagenson found the same in the same issue. So it seems pretty clear that this is a thing, that lay people are biased against the notion of innate knowledge. The real question is why? There are many reasons why people might be biased against innateness. So, right, perhaps they're just ignorant, perhaps they have blindness of innateness, perhaps they have mind reading blindness, or maybe they have social concerns, right? If we are innately different from each other, then maybe that will encourage discrimination and so forth. I think that each of these proposals have merits. They are right in their own way, but they're insufficient to explain what's going on here. And they're insufficient because they fail to explain the selectivity of the bias, why it's specifically knowledge that people deny. If you're concerned about social discrimination, you might be concerned about innate aggression, not about innate notion of number. So why innate knowledge? And what I'd like to suggest is that our blindness to human nature arises from the very workings of the human mind. There are 2 suspects in crime. One is the intuitive dualism, and the other is intuitive essentialism. Each of them is broadly documented in the literature. What has not been noticed before is that these 2 intuitive biases stand in mutual conflict to each other, such that when they combine, they collide to form this perfect cognitive storm. And this is how it arises. When we reason about innateness, we rely on our essentialist intuitions. We believe that people are what they are because they are born with some innate essence. But critically, this essence resides in the body. Problem is that people are also intuitive dualists, and they think that knowledge resides outside the body. It resides in the mind. So it's no wonder that people conclude that knowledge cannot be innate. It's in the wrong place for being innate per essentialism. Notice that what's bad here is the logic. It's completely baloney, right? And it's this logic that drives people's intuitions about innateness. And we have shown that in a bunch of papers that we have published that shown that indeed it's this logic that drives lay people's intuition. So I'm not going to go into this because we don't have time and because this is in press. And instead I want to talk about the more disturbing question of why we reasoned in this way and try to give you just a hint on why that might be the case. So of course this could be just us, weird people. It could be because of learning from culture, but the most more disturbing possibility is that this is happening by design. To begin thinking about this question, which we can't completely right now, we need to know, are the ingredients innate? And do these ingredients always collide to form the storm? And we don't know the answer to either. For essentialism, with respect to the ingredients, there is pretty good evidence that essentialism is innate in the sense that it emerges spontaneously in the absence of evidence, not at birth, but spontaneous. But dualism has been subject to a lot of criticism recently. So the notion that people is dualist really requires some defending, because if that's not true, then my theory goes out the window. So I want to spend some time talking about that. How can dualism arise naturally? Well, a long time ago, Paul Bloom suggested that dualism arises from the confluence of two core knowledge systems. One is intuitive physics, and the other is theory of mind. Intuitive physics tells us objects can only interact by contact. But theory of mind tells us that if I want to reach to the coffee, it's because I have some desire to do so, even though there's no object that pushes my arm to move. So looking at that, people might conclude that mental states are distinct from bodies, and that's how dualism might be born. Now, this theory actually carries a testable prediction, which is, if mental state beget dualism, and if dualism partly begets empiricism, then it follows that if we were going to disrupt theory of mind, that in turn should disrupt dualism, and that further should also have implication down the road to empiricism. We know how theory of mind is disrupted. We don't need to do that. It happens naturally in autism. So the question then is it the case that people with autism are less dualist, more nativist, and is that related to their theory of mind? So to find out, we gave people tests first of dualism. For example, you can ask them to reason about a body replication situation. So if you had a donor, and suppose it was possible to create a replica of the donor that will keep every aspect of the human donor and brain, tell us which of the following traits will transfer to the replica. And those traits are either epistemic or non-epistemic, and we are looking at 30 participants per group. The reasoning is that for non-epistemic traits like walking and seeing, we can link them easily to the body. Epistemic traits are far harder for us to link to the body intuitively. So if we are dualist, that is our fertile grounds, because if we're dualist, we're going to say that those traits are outside the body, and therefore they will not transfer to the replica. So are people dualist? Do they really think that epistemic traits are less likely to transfer? And second, are people with autism less dualist, meaning they're more likely to think that psychological traits will transfer? So overall, the answer for the first question, yes, people are dualist, and yes, they think that epistemic traits are significantly less likely to transfer to the replica compared to non-epistemic traits. There is also a main effect of group, such that overall, people with autism think that psychological traits are more embodied. They're more likely to transfer to the replica. And we're looking at epistemic traits. This is where the group differences get interesting. When you ask neurotypical participants, does, say, a sense of number, will that transfer to the replica? They're not sure. They're sitting on the fence. But people with autism tell you, sure it will. It's in the body. Now, to make sure that this is not just a response bias, in a second experiment, we asked them the opposite. Which of the traits are disembodied? Which of them will transfer to the afterlife when the body no longer exists? Again, if ethereal traits are outside the body, then they ought to now persist in the afterlife, opposite to what we said before. And the question is, A, are people dualist? And second, are people with autism less dualist? So overall, people are indeed showing signs of dualism. They think that that epistemic traits are more ethereal now. Now they're the ones that are more likely to transfer. In this experiment, there is not a significant main effect of group, but when we compare responses to epistemic traits, again, there are interesting differences such that neurotypical participants tell you, yes, for sure, those traits will persist in the afterlife, whereas now it's the people with autism that are sitting in the fence. So it looks like people with autism are indeed less dualist. So what about empiricism now? If dualism begets empiricism, they should be also less empiricist. To find out, we asked people to reason about innateness. Tell us which of the following traits are inborn in the sense that they will emerge without the opportunity to learn them from others. And there are two questions. First, if people are empiricists, they'll think that epistemic traits are less likely to be inborn. And is empiricism attenuated in autism? The answer to both is yes. Overall, people are less likely to think that epistemic traits are innate, replicating what we've shown before. There is a significant main effect of groups such that people with autism now are overall more likely to think that those traits, all psychological traits, are inborn. And indeed, in response to epistemic traits, again, the groups differ. So neurotypical participants say, no way that epistemic traits are inborn, whereas here it's the people with autism that are sitting on the fence. So I've shown you that indeed there is a disruption of both dualism and empiricism, but the question is that really linked to theory of mind? So in the last experiment, to find out, we gave people now two tasks. One, looking at theory of mind, false belief test. The other is the dualist test that we looked at before, and we're asking, is there a correlation? For neurotypical participants, this is exactly what we found. I'll tell you about the autism results later. There's also a correlation there. And the correlation is such that we're looking at response time to the theory of mind. The harder time you have on theory of mind, the slower you are, the less likely you are to say that psychological traits will persist in the afterlife. So difficulties with theory of mind are linked to physicalism. There are limitations here, right? Correlation between theory of mind of dualism is not causation. So we don't know that dualism is natural and universal, and we certainly we haven't established that empiricism is innate. However, what we've shown is that dualism is linked to theory of mind, and the putative disruption to theory of mind in autism affects both dualism and essentialism. And that's in line with the idea that we are natural dualists and natural empiricists. Now, I don't know that, right, we don't know necessarily that why we're dualists. We haven't solved this one. So even if dualism isn't natural, the fact that we see those biases should give us pause as scholars, because if we as scholars are biased, and if scholars are people, then we really need to, we are a danger, and we should really proceed with caution. And thank you. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I actually was really inspired by your work and Lisa's, and did a focus group study asking some of these similar questions with different populations. And I was really struck by when people were talking about these questions about our different aspects of cognition innate, they were really uncertain. So in tasks like this, where you're asking people to choose, the data looks relatively clear, but when we were watching conversations happen, some people were just like, I don't know, and they kind of talk it out and kind of get there gradually maybe. And I'm still trying to think about this uncertainty aspect and how it relates to to work like yours, but I'm curious your reaction
Yeah.
to that uncertainty and the fact that there were big differences between people and how they were
Yeah.
approaching that. And,
Yeah,
and the
I hear you.
familiarity and the kind of
Yeah.
feeling like, well, I've never thought about it before,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
No, you're absolutely right. So the possibility that we are biased doesn't mean that this is the only thing that affects our intuitions. People also have, are educated in science, so they know that the mind is part of the body and that could offset many of these intuitions. So you exactly would expect people to have uncertainty. And for this reason, I think the only way to look at these questions is in relative terms rather than absolute terms. So the question is, do we have this bias that's kind of whispering in our ears? It's not necessarily that people are going to say, these things are never innate.
Hi, Iris, thanks. That was an excellent talk. I'm
Thank
Dina
you.
DeVetti from Brock. My question is, it's sort of building on what you just said, which is that there's learning about the mind-brain connection. And so autistic individuals have been through therapy, and they're told from a young age, you're special, your brain is different.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how much of that do you think might play into how they connect, knowledge to the brain versus your typical person who might not?
So, so let's see. So if you know that, so one way to think, it can play different ways.
Right.
One of them is if you know that you have cognitive limitations that are inborn, that can certainly bias, well, your limitations are in theory of mind, not necessarily cognitive, actually. So that's the opposite. So why would you think it's epistemic states specifically that are less likely to be inborn? So I'll have to think about it, but I don't necessarily see a direct link between that and the diagnosis.
So who are your regular people? Like, who are they?
They're both recruited from Prolific, both the typical and neurotypical, both either attested that they have received a formal diagnosis of autism or that they have not.
Okay, yeah. Oh, it's something to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me just make sure that I'm not running out of time. So let me ask, Jenny, am I right on my calculation that you're supposed to start at 3:15? That looks too optimistic to me.
Sorry, I have no idea.
Let's see. Hold on. Let me just check when we're supposed to, because now everything is, I don't want to take time that was not ours. Sorry. Excuse me. So, 3:15. We're good. Thank you. Yeah, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the great talk.
Thank you.
So if I remember correctly, the data from Wenck and Feigenson, I think, had the aspect that people are perfectly happy to attribute knowledge to non-human animals. For example, to attribute knowledge to fish about how to find their way to, some other geographic location. So if this perhaps false memory of mine is correct, then how would you fit it into your proposal?
So I don't remember that part of their experiment, and I certainly don't remember what control that they had. We had experiments in which we presented people with matched traits, say in birds, such that knowledge of bird song, so AXB song in swamp sparrows versus a certain structure of their motor behavior, and we explicitly matched that and asked people, so how likely is it to be innate? And the epistemic trait was significantly less likely to be innate even in birds and in we also looked at aliens and we looked at other animals. So when you have the proper control, people project exactly the same biases to animals as well.
Hi, I loved your talk.
Thank you.
Are we supposed to introduce ourselves? Okay, I'm Sam. Sorry, I'm Sam. I work in Askin's Labs. I have a sort of academic sociology question, maybe which you started to allude to at the end of your talk. There are whole, I guess, fields of study where there's a real strong bias against innateness of any kind of claim, and I'm wondering, I guess, could you say a bit about how much of your idea of where this comes from in lay people explains that, or do you think like, would you say that this is why?
It's a good, great question, thank you. I have to be very careful here, right? I started.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, but I think we all need to be. So the last thing so I got to this tradition because my day job is looking at experimental phonology, universal grammar, and I could never understand why people thought that the notion of universal grammar that Paul Smolensko is sitting here helped develop, why people consider it as non-possibility. And that's what led me to this research program. I don't think, there are many reasons why scientists might think this is not plausible. So I don't want to say that if you don't agree with my view of phonology, then you're an empiricist, right? That's not right and that's not fair. So we need to be very careful before we accuse anybody of this bias. So I think, when looking at scientists, we really need to be careful. We need to the extent that as humans we have this, if this intuitive bias is true, then we need to be mindful of that. That doesn't mean that you can't stand and say you're wrong in your work on phonology because you haven't control for X, Y, Z. So that's, we need to be careful about that. So unless there are questions, I'm suspicious that I'm doing something wrong here. So let's move to Jenny because I just might want to make sure. Jenny, are you there?
I'm here. I think Asifa tells me that we are maybe a little bit behind schedule, but I'm sure it'll be okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
She did a faster calculation than I could. So.
Okay, so 20 minutes for each, and the discussion will. I'll make sure I'm following that. Sorry about that.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay, all right, looks like you're all seeing my slides. Okay, great, so so my talk is picking up on some of the themes we've heard about so far, but also a little bit different. Take it easy on me, folks. I'm COVID positive and my brain is not functioning at 100%, but I'm gonna do my best. Okay, so my work is interested in a very general challenge, namely explaining why languages look the way they do. Are you seeing my slides advance? Can someone give me a thumbs up if you are? Okay, good.
We see the slide, we don't see the move yet.
Okay, because that's what it looked like to me. It says my screen sharing is paused. I don't know why.
Technical support.
Hold on, I'm just clicking a button that says resume, but it doesn't do anything. Not sure why that would be. Not one I've encountered before. Anyone seen this one before? I'll just
Maybe just restart.
Yeah.
Try ending your screen share and then share again.
Okay, will do. Yeah, it keeps saying that the screen sharing is paused. Do not know why.
Archers, are you there?
Yes, I'm looking whether I could do anything for this, but I think this is on Jenny's end.
All right,
Thank
people.
you.
I'm not sure.
If we can't get it right, one possibility is maybe to switch to Asifa and to get, is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I can poke around and see if I find anything on the web about how to fix this in the meantime. But
In the meantime, can you send Encore Room 103 your file in the Zoom chat? And then we can
yeah, sure.
share it for you, probably.
And you can print it to PDF and just use Acrobat or something.
Hi,
So
Jenny, I made you co-host. Maybe you can try again. Maybe that will change something.
Okay, let me try. I'll try one more time and then.
Yes, please. And we'll cut the discussion, so I'm sorry, I completely miscalculated. I can't count.
Okay.
You could when you were a newborn.
I know. We go downhill.
This is strange. I've never seen this weird option before. Is it gonna work? Yay! I
Yay.
think it works.
Okay,
Okay.
3:15, go for
Okay,
it.
we're on. All right, thanks. Thanks for your patience. Okay, right. So the general challenge I'm interested in is trying to understand why languages look the way they do. So as we all know, there's lots of reasons. So language typology is shaped by a multitude of factors. Some of them may be to do with our linguistic system, so the kind of core knowledge that that Iris was talking about. But typology is also shaped by other features of our cognition, our perception that are not specific to the linguistic system, so domain general mechanisms or biases. And of course, typology is shaped by cognition external factors, facts about history, geography, etc. So I'm particularly interested in understanding, for a given typological pattern that we see, how can we determine which of these things play a role? Maybe they all do, maybe some subset of them do. How can we actually determine that? And traditional approaches in linguistics have tackled this question mainly by doing things like looking at introspection, looking at grammars, doing field work, taking typological samples, looking at corpora. And those are all very important tools. Indeed, important discoveries have been made with those tools, but also very big claims. And so I want to highlight some limitations of this kind of approach. So for one, a lot of the traditional data are quite sparse and have bias problems with sample bias. There's lots of confounds. We all know that there's a focus on English and other spoken European languages. And importantly, it's kind of indirect data. So it doesn't actually support causal links with linguistic or cognitive or other mechanisms. For that, we need different kinds of evidence. So in this talk, I'm going to give you just a little taste of a different kind of evidence, namely experimental evidence for universality or non-universality of particular cognitive or linguistic biases. And the kinds of experiments that I'm going to talk about can help us to get at where these biases might come from. So the approach is to take typology as a starting point. So we look at typological samples, typological data, and notice that some types of patterns are more common than others. So for example, we might notice that languages tend to have suffixing rather than prefixing. So that's a starting point. And from there, I'm going to describe to you some experimental evidence, sort of probing sort of claims that are based on typology. I'm going to do that by looking across language populations. So that's going to be the kind of main take-home message of this talk, that we can't really do this kind of work without taking a look at different kinds of populations. We can't just use English speakers as our data. So I'm going to start with the suffixing preference. So this is one that probably a lot of people are familiar with. So if you look at a large sample of languages, you will see that inflectional morphology tends to be realized as suffixal rather than prefixal. So this table sort of gives you the latest numbers. And it's been claimed that the suffixing preference is driven by universal processing and perceptual mechanisms. So for example, it's been argued that beginnings of words are special or salient, they should be reserved for lexical content, and that related words are grouped together based on similarities at the start. So there's one very interesting study Hupp et al. 2009. So they found that English speakers perceive sequences that differ at their ends to be more similar. So that's kind of akin to a suffixing language. So they did this by showing people sequences like this, so a base sequence like tate, and then asking them which of the following sequences are more similar to that base sequence. Something like this, where there's an additional sequence stuck at the beginning, or something like this, where there's an additional sequence stuck at the end. And in their task, people consistently chose the suffix sequence. Okay, and they also did this with shapes. So they might show participants a sequence of shapes, and then a prefix sequence and a suffix sequence, and people just judge the suffix sequence as more similar. Okay, so that's super interesting, and it seems to validate this idea that there's a kind of universal perceptual bias at play that explains this universal. But this study was done with English speakers, and in fact, almost all the research that's been done on the suffixing bias from a psychological standpoint has been done with speakers of English or closely related languages, which of course are suffixing languages. So I want to tell you about a recent study where we actually tried to look what would happen if we were taking speakers across different, who spoke different languages. In particular, we want to target speakers who have a language experience that's quite different from English and related languages. In particular, a language that's heavily prefixing instead of one that's heavily suffixing. So here I'm showing you an example sentence from a language called Kidaraka. This is a Bantu language spoken in Kenya. And the phrase you see here is these two beautiful cats, or kittens. And what you can see is there is this marker at the beginning of all the words, two, and that is an agreement marker that occurs on all the elements in the noun phrase. And you can see that it's a prefix. And like many other Bantu languages, this is a heavily prefixing language. So we replicated the Hupp et al. Study using English speakers and Kidaraka speakers. So here you can see for English, this is the proportion of choices where the element was had something added at the end, so the kind of suffixed looking element. And so you can see that English speakers indeed choose that that kind of element. So we replicate the original study. But Kidaraka speakers have the opposite preference. So Kidaraka speakers choose the element that's changed from the base sequence at the beginning rather than at the end. And this is also found if we're doing shape sequences. So this effect is found both for syllables and for shapes. Okay, so what that shows you is the importance of doing this kind of research across different language populations. So perhaps thinking about it, it's really not that surprising that English speakers have this preference. After all, they have tons of experience with words that are related to each other in this particular way. But Kidaraka speakers have the opposite experience, and it translates exactly to this kind of task. So that calls into question, in fact, this idea that there's a universal processing or perceptual bias. Maybe there is, but maybe there's not. We clearly don't have evidence from these kinds of experiments for that. And in fact, there are alternative theories out there. So for example, it's been shown that affix position can be traced back to the position of an independent word before it's fused. So maybe this is really something about syntax and not about morphology. It's also been shown that prosodic breaks favor fusion of following words. So this could be something about processes of language change that really don't have much to do with perception. Okay, so that's the first case study. The second one has to do with word order harmony. So this is one of the most famous so-called language universals. Like the suffixing preference, it's a typological tendency. So it has to do with alignment of heads and dependents across phrases. So you can see a couple of examples here where head and dependent order are aligned across different types of phrases. So across VP and prepositional phrase, across prepositional phrase and phrases with a genitive and a noun, across different types of modifiers within a noun phrase like adjectives and numerals. Okay, and one potential explanation for why the typology has this tendency is the interaction between a universal bias for simplicity and linguistic specific categories. So in particular, we have some linguistic knowledge that drives our perceptions about what things are similar to what other things, what's a head and what's a dependent. So linguistic categories determine what's to be aligned, but harmonic alignment means fewer rules. So if I can say, yes, all modifiers of a noun occur on the same side of the noun, then I can have a single general rule that, that accounts for that ordering rather than modifier-specific rules. Okay, so that makes a prediction that learning harmonic patterns should be easier than learning non-harmonic patterns. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies that probe that. So in previous experimental work, again, it's something that people have looked at, myself, with English speakers only. So in some original studies I did back in 2012, we showed people sort of noisy harmonic patterns. So we taught them a language that had nouns, adjectives, and numerals. They might hear a phrase that had an adjective preceding a noun, but sometimes they might hear an adjective following the noun. And similar for numerals, they might sometimes hear a prenominal numeral, sometimes a postnominal numeral. So we gave people noisy patterns that either tended to be harmonic or tended to be non-harmonic. And what we found is that if you were learning a mostly harmonic pattern, you tended to regularize that pattern. So you made it more regularly harmonic, more consistently harmonic. If you learned a mostly non-harmonic pattern, you tended to kind of actually make it harmonic. But that's with English speakers, and English is a harmonic language. So again, this is something we need to look at across different language populations in order to be really convinced. So in some more recent work, I've done a follow-up study which looks at English, French, and Hebrew speakers, both children and adults. So English is harmonic, but French and Hebrew are non-harmonic in this domain. So they have adjectives after the noun and numerals before. So what I'm showing you here is a proportion of learners whose productions conformed to one of the 4 possible ways of ordering elements in this domain. So both modifiers before the noun, both after, or adjectives after and numerals before, or adjectives before and numerals after. So what you can see here is that across all of these populations, there's more green than there is red. So all of the participants across all of these populations are more likely to produce harmonic orders than non-harmonic orders. Okay, so that suggests that in this case, we do have something that looks more like a universal bias, or at least we have stronger evidence that that's a universal bias. Now, what I argued before is that it has to do with simplicity. And of course, simplicity is not a domain-specific bias, it's a domain general bias. So if that's really the case, then we should be able to see a preference for harmony in non-linguistic categories. And I was supposed to present a poster about this, but since I couldn't make it to CUGSA, I didn't present it. So you're gonna get a little speeded version here. So what we did in this study was design 2 different types of kind of non-linguistic-y languages. So the first used nonsense words and the second shapes. And in each case, we have a set of 2 different types of heads, and those heads occur with their own kinds of dependents that sort of match them in particular ways. So we designed this so that similarity between the categories was quite obvious for people, and all people had to learn was how the ordering goes. So how are heads ordered relative to their dependents. So what people saw in this experiment was sequences like this. So if you were in the nonsense words task, you might see something like this. And then after training, you're just asked, well, which of these sequences matches the one you've seen? And same thing for the shapes. So people might see this kind of pattern or this, and then they have to click which one they think matches the ones they've seen. And here we have 3 different conditions. So people either learned that modifiers always come before heads, so that's a harmonic condition, or they learned that for one type of head, modifiers came on one side, and for the other type of head, they came on the other side. Or they learned that a given head had some modifiers that came before and some modifiers that came after. So our prediction is that the harmonic pattern should be easiest to learn, and the non-harmonic within heads should be most difficult to learn. So that's the one where both heads had modifiers on either side. And that's exactly what we find. And we see that same pattern of results for both the nonsense words and shapes. So that supports the idea that the preference for harmony has as its root a kind of non-linguistic bias for simplicity. Of course, it interacts with linguistic specific categories, so it's linguistic in that sense. But yeah, in any case. Okay, so onto my last case study. So here we're turning to more complex noun phrase word order. So here we're you're seeing the frequency of orders of noun, adjective, numeral, and demonstrative all put together in one phrase. So almost all of these orders are in fact attested. There's 24 of them, but some are more common than others. So for example, orders like Thai, English, French are very common. Orders like Kikuyu are less common. And it turns out that these three orders, Thai, French, and English, have something in common with one another. Namely, the adjective is closest to the noun, then the numeral, and the demonstrative is farthest away from the noun. The Kikuyu pattern doesn't have that property. And if we just color the orders based on whether they have that feature, you can see that orders that have that feature are amongst the most common. So almost 80% of the world's languages have that feature, adjectives closest to the noun, demonstratives farthest away. And one way to think about what these orders have in common is that there's a kind of underlying structure. I'm not going to make any commitments about what kind of structure it is. Maybe it's a syntactic structure, maybe it's a conceptual structure. You can ask me about that if you're curious. But the idea is that this structure doesn't tell you exactly what the linear order is. It just gives you this idea about what should be close to what. Okay, so that derives 8 different orders. Those are the very common orders. So the idea is that the skewed frequency of noun phrase orders is driven by this kind of underlying, universal underlying structure, plus a bias for orders that are homomorphic to that structure. So a bias for orders that transparently reflect that structure. But again, what we want to do is actually look to see if we can find experimental evidence for that. And a couple of years ago, we looked for evidence of that in English speakers. So what we did is train people on a very simple language that had a noun and a single modifier, either demonstrative or an adjective. So people learned those words, but they never had any evidence as to how adjectives and demonstratives are ordered relative to one another. And then at test, we just asked them to extrapolate. So we asked them to take a guess as to what the order in the language will be. And we predicted that they should produce noun, adjective, demonstrative. That's the homomorphic order for post-nominal modifiers. And that's exactly what we find. So we actually teach people this in 3 different conditions. So either demonstrative adjective or demonstrative numeral or numeral adjective. And in each of those cases, people produce homomorphic orders near categorically. But of course, you can see the trend. This is English speakers, and that's really not enough because English is homomorphic. So it's a good place to start, but it's not the end of the story. So in more recent work, we're replicating this experiment with Kitaraka speakers. So Kitaraka speakers you've seen before because they're speakers of a prefixing language, but they're also speakers of a language that has a non-homomorphic order. So again, the phrase, these 2 beautiful kittens, you can see the order is noun, demonstrative, numeral, adjective. So that's about as non-homomorphic as you can get. Adjectives should be close to the noun, but in fact, they're furthest away. So when we replicate this experiment with those speakers, we nevertheless still find that they have a preference for producing homomorphic orders in this domain. So here they're producing pre-nominal orders. So these are people who don't have any experience with English. They're producing pre-nominal homomorphic orders in the same way that English speakers were producing post-nominal homomorphic orders. Okay, so that's my story. So as I said at the beginning, my main goal is to understand why languages look the way they do. And there's a multitude of potential factors and many hypotheses. But we kind of really need new sources of evidence to help adjudicate between those competing hypotheses. So there's often a lot of ink spilled about which of these factors is the best explanation. But based on the typology alone, we simply don't know the answer to that. So we need direct behavioral evidence that can show us, help us to probe where these biases are coming from. And sometimes this evidence points to universal biases of particular kinds, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's what makes this interesting stuff. So why should you care? Well, I think you should care because this kind of research gives us evidence for what we want to think of as core properties of human learners. So they get at questions about what kind of biases we bring to the task of language learning. To what degree are we sensitive to hierarchical representations? What are the effects of linguistic experience on perception? So I think these are things that any cognitive scientist would be interested in. And non-universals and universals alike have important implications for theories of language and theories of language evolution. And just as an extra added take-home message, again, we really can't claim evidence for universals based on English alone. And it seems really obvious, but yet so much of the work that's been done in this domain over the years and it's a kind of growing field of work using experimental methods to look at this kind of stuff, but still a lot of it is done based on English, and that's something that we simply can't do going forward. Okay, so that's my spiel, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
3 minutes. Thank you very much. Online?
No questions online so far.
Question is coming.
Hey Jenny, this is Josh Hartzman from Boston College. Sorry you're not
Hi.
sorry you're not here. So this is very cool work. Yeah, I've been reading it following it for a while. I have a question about scale, because I absolutely agree that you are right that we need to be looking at more languages, but you also look at the sheer amount of work that we have done on English and still don't understand it very well. And it turns out there's a whole lot of languages. What do you think are good, what have you been thinking about in terms of the strategy for sort of efficiently or at scale looking at testing things cross-linguistically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have a very particular technique, which is to look at populations whose language background makes very different predictions about how they might behave in the task, depending on the hypothesis, right? So in the cases I was telling you about, I'm picking populations, where the language of the speakers either conforms to or doesn't conform to the universal of that's being postulated. So that's a kind of sparse way of doing that. It's not always easy, because these things are proposed as universals for a reason. It's rare that languages flout them, but I think it's those populations that are of the most interest. If we're finding biases in those populations, then that's the strongest possible evidence that we could find, and I think that allows us to be a little bit more confident without potentially testing tons and tons of speakers of different languages indiscriminately.
We have like barely a minute for another question.
We have a couple questions online. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, there's a couple of
We'll take the question in the room. I'm sorry.
Okay. Hi.
Hey, no, we should take a question online. We haven't done it yet. I'm using my speaker prerogative.
We'll have a discussion later. We'll take the question online and reserve the one in the room for later.
Okay, so Asifa asks, do you have ideas about which properties should be universal or not? I wish that I had a better answer to that question. I mean, I tend to think that universals that have a potential domain general explanation are the most promising ones, but that isn't necessarily based on anything but my own potential biases as a researcher, which have changed over time, in fact. So yeah, I know that's not a very good question. I think if we had a better answer to that, we could be more targeted in what we were looking for. But,
yeah.
Anyway,
I'm
looking at the rest of your questions, and I can take a shot at them in the chat. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we have to move to Asifa, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of discussion later.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, we have to move on. Sorry. Okay. But keep the question for discussion, because we will have some. Asifa, are you connected? So we have Asifa Majid.
Hopefully this works.
Asifa, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you?
Please go ahead.
Great. So thank you for this wonderful session. I think it wouldn't be right to be in a session about diversity without acknowledging the UNESCO International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which began this year, 2022. And it's with this background in mind that I introduce some of my own thinking about this, which is trying to take a diverse perspective on the nature of mind. So for me, I'm interested in trying to extrapolate across different communities what might be common and what might be distinct. And one question that's been guiding my research over the last years is whether there's some perceptual domains that are more amenable to linguistic coding and consciousness than others. And this one large study that we attempted to try and answer this question compared across diverse languages and communities. So diverse on as many different parameters as we could within the confines of practicality. So culturally diverse, sampling people from many different subsistence types that vary in their cultural practices and activities, that live in different environments, and that speak typologically diverse languages, including both signed and spoken languages. And of course, you can't do this kind of work without collaboration. So this is a team science project working with researchers who are experts in the particular languages that we were examining. Because we're interested in the coding of perception, we looked at different visual phenomena, so colors and shapes, for example, sounds, touch, taste, and smell, asking whether it is in fact the case that visual and auditory phenomena are more amenable to linguistic coding and conscious reflection than what are sometimes called the lower senses of smell, touch, and taste. So to test that, we put together a battery of stimuli, trying to sample each perceptual domain according to what we knew about the psychophysics at the time, and presented speakers of the 20 different languages with each stimulus one at a time, and asked them simply to name that stimulus. And from their responses, we can then code codability of each of the stimuli that we present participants. And codability is a notion that Brannon Lenneberg introduced in the 50s. And here I'm just going to focus on agreement. So are colors and shapes give rise to higher agreement in how they should be called than things like smell and taste? So if we look at our 20 different communities here on one side, and how codable they are, so close to 0 would mean low codability, low agreement in how a thing is called, and close to 1 would be high agreement or high codability. But also we can just look at the relative codability of each sense. We can see that for English, for example, visual phenomena like colors and shapes are indeed high codability, but they're low codability for languages like Umpala. Taste is high for Farsi or Lao speakers, but relatively low for English speakers. So out of the 20 languages that we sampled in this study, there was 13 different rank orders of the senses, suggesting that there isn't a universal hierarchy of the senses in the matter in which they're coded. So as well as looking at codability, we can just look at the lexical facts. So if we take color, we know that English shows high elaboration in the color field, in contrast with languages like Umpala, spoken by a hunter-gatherer community in Cape York, Australia, which only have 3 terms, black, white, and red. In contrast, English shows relatively poor lexical elaboration in the field of smell, in contrast with languages like Jahai, which show many distinctions in their basic smell vocabulary. Even if we look at the types of semantic notions that are coded, they vary. So if we think about sounds, English refers to variation in pitch as high versus low, whereas Farsi and Turkish speakers talk about thin versus thick pitches instead. Now, given this lexical diversity, it would seem compatible with an idea that the infant starts blank slate. But that's not what we find. So if we look at infant preferences for color, for example, using a very nice eye tracking paradigm that Anna Franklin developed in 2005, where you just show a colored dot against a colored background, you change the background color so it's either the same category as the dot or a different category. and the categories here are determined on the basis of English categories, then you see that infants are faster to look from a central fixation spot to the colored dot when that dot is in a different color category. Now, you wouldn't predict that if the infant didn't already have some notions of color and play. And in later work, Anna Franklin's group has shown, using a different method, that infants have 7 different color categories that they're born with, spanning the whole color space. And there seems to be some similarities between what the infant is showing and what we see cross-linguistically recurring motifs if you look at what languages do when they have 7 color categories. The same seems to hold for sounds as well. So if we look at the association between different spatial dimensions such as high, low, and thin, thick, then 4-month-old infants who haven't yet learnt the lexical categories nevertheless show preferences for these sorts of associations. So in hearing a dynamic audio glide going from high pitch to low pitch, infants prefer to look at a ball that's moving in the same congruent direction as the audio, as you would predict, matching the English mapping. And they show the same preference for thickness dimensions that vary congruent with the audio pitch changes, suggesting again this is something that the infants are sensitive to before they've learned their language specific mappings. So what we have here is evidence that infants are already have quite strong notions of colors and sounds, for example, and yet as adults they're showing quite considerable variation in the semantic packaging, which of course raises the question whether adults in these different communities show categories non-linguistically that align with their language-specific patterning, or whether they might show evidence of what the infants are already displaying before they've learnt language. And here, when we look at the evidence, there seems to be quite strong evidence, in the perceptual modalities at least, that non-linguistic perception and cognition goes along with linguistic coding. So starting with the work of Debbie Robertson from the 1990s, who already showed that for the a community with different color categories to English, memory went along with the linguistic coding. To the more recent review paper by Gary Lupin and colleagues, we can see that across a number of studies now, that vision, attention, and what comes into conscious reflection seems to be going along with what is linguistically coded in different language communities. Similarly for sounds, if you play a person a sound, a single tone, in one of 2 conditions where they're either seeing a visual stimulus that's at different heights on the screen or of different thicknesses on a screen, and then ask them to sing back the tone that they heard and look to see whether the frequency of the sound that they heard matches the frequency of the sound that they reproduced as a function of the stimulus that they saw, which is irrelevant to the sound that they've actually heard. Then again, we see cross-linguistic differences. So here, Dutch speakers who, like English, have a high-low metaphor show a congruency effect in the vertical dimension, but Farsi speakers who have a thin-thick metaphor don't. Whereas Farsi speakers show a congruency effect in the light of a thick stimulus that Dutch speakers don't. And this is something that, again, has been replicated using different paradigms. So in a more recent study, we've shown even with simple stimuli, like the ones that we show to infants, adults speaking Dutch and Turkish who differ in their linguistic coding show cross-linguistic, cross-cultural differences in their non-linguistic sound space associations. And in a director-matcher task, where 2 people hear a set of melodies and have to describe to the other person what they've heard, where the 2 have to decide whether they've heard the same sequence of notes or not, we see that whereas Dutch speakers use spatial height in their gestures to indicate the pitch of the sound that they've heard, Farsi speakers don't use this reliably or as reliably, again suggesting that non-linguistic spatial representations are being shaped by the linguistic encodings of each community. Now, altogether, that suggests that the way that we see or perhaps hear the world might be tinted by the particular languages that we speak. In the field of smell, it's a little bit less clear. So here, the linguistic evidence for variation in how speakers talk about smells is only just emerging, and we don't have the same handle on the linguistic categories themselves. But it has been claimed that there's large differences across cultures in how we perceive odors, where a dominant dimension of odor perception is just how pleasant an odor is. So Westerners often find the smell of durian to be quite disgusting, whereas in Asia, durian is considered quite a delicacy, even though the smell is so strong that it's banned from many hotels and you can't take it into a hotel room. But nevertheless, this kind of evidence is appealed to show that odor preferences are entirely culturally mediated and that there are no innate preferences or universal preferences for odors. So we decided to test this recently in a cross-cultural study where we sampled people from different environments, different urban communities, so from a city in Thailand, Mexico City, and from New York in the States. But it's also some different hunter-gatherer communities and agriculturalists as well. And in amongst this sample, we have communities that have a lexical field for smell, like the Chapala speaking Chachi, or the Seri in Mexico, and those that do not, like American English speakers or Spanish Mexican speakers that we tested. So we have a variety of participants in our study, and we started our investigation based on a study that had been published in Science a few years earlier. So in that study, Keller et al. Sampled a wide variety of odors that spanned a chemical space and asked 49 Americans to rate them for pleasantness. And what they found was that they could predict the pleasantness of the molecules, so how nice people perceive that odor to be, based on the chemoinformatic features of the particular molecule, suggesting that there might be shared preferences here. So what we did was we took those 476 molecules and we sampled 10 odors that were the most diverse over this space. We did a really simple study. So we put those odors in markers, and we gave participants 10 different markers with 10 different odors. And what they had to do was put those markers in order from the most pleasant smell to the least pleasant smell. So it's a simple rank order task, and we do this across multiple participants in our 10 different communities. And what we find is, much to my surprise, that odor preferences are shared to a large extent across cultures. And when we model the data, we find that culture only accounts for 6% of the variance of the data. There are a lot of individual differences in odor preferences, but there's also a large shared component, the universal component, if you like. In fact, if you look at any individual and correlate how strongly they correlate with people within their community versus everybody else in the sample, you see that they correlate as well with any other person from anywhere else in the world as they do from people within their own community. And if we look at how we can see how well we can predict how pleasant a molecule is based on the other odors that we've got data for, and we can predict odor pleasantness across cultures based on chemical properties of the odor, again suggesting that there's a universal basis here. Now this actually fits with the infant data quite well. If you test newborn infants, you find that they really like the smell of vanilla, for example, and don't like the smell of isovaleric acid, say, that smells like sweaty feet. But here, actually, the story is a bit more complicated. In fact, these pictures come from a study that Benoit Schall and colleagues did, where they showed they assigned pregnant mothers, to eat food either with anise, aniseed, a licorice sort of smell, or garlic. And what they found was that infants, when they're born, prefer the odors that their mothers had during the pregnancy. So if the infant is given aniseed and the mother's been eating that, they really like it. But if the mother hasn't been, they really don't like it. And so what I want to leave with is the suggestion that already at infancy, children are being enculturated into the perceptual fields of their particular community. And we need to take that into consideration when we interpret the infant data. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we have 3 minutes for questions for Asifa and then a few minutes for general discussion.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering, along in the category learning literature, sometimes there's people that make this distinction between perceptual categories and linguistic categories that does not seem like very obvious for me. I feel like it's some kind of like a continuum. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, like after all the interesting stuff you have presented to us, if there's really such a thing as a difference between a perceptual category and a linguistic category.
And you want to introduce yourself.
Sorry?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Fernanda Persgay. Thank you.
Hi, lovely. Thank you for your question. At least in the lab, we can make the distinction. So we can look at learning of categories without linguistic input and with linguistic input. It is a question to what extent, without linguistic input, whether language really isn't involved at all. So I think what some of the studies have been showing is even if a task doesn't require the recruitment of language in order to do it, that nevertheless people seem to be recruiting language to do even basic tasks. So for example, Gary Lupian's work has shown that even in visual search, labels seem to be involved. So I do think that where it can be tricky, but I also think it is possible and it's interesting to be able to tease those things apart.
Online question? If not, we have questions in the room.
There are online
we
questions.
have it. Yeah. So Martin Hokwan asks, does culture affect the tolerance of certain bad odors?
Yes. So
sorry, if I may clarify a little bit, I was just wondering, so if you grew up in an urban setting, you might be more exposed to sewage or certain really bad odors. So I'm just wondering, does the strength of certain odor or the threshold to which you would tolerate certain odors be affected by culture rather than just a simple, like a hierarchy that may be culturally universal? Thanks so much.
yeah, thank you for your question.
And thanks so much for your talk.
So there's two bits of information that might be interesting there. So one is olfaction is an area where mere repetition effect seems to be quite strong. So simply smelling an odor over and over again makes people like it more or dislike it less. So in that sense, there's a very simple mechanism that could explain some of the cultural differences. I think the ethnographic record suggests something a bit more complex, but maybe that's a bit of a longer answer. There's a slightly different question I detect in there, which is just how sensitive people are to smells. And here there's conflicting lines of evidence. So there's some evidence that when you smell something for a long time, you become habituated to it, and so you don't detect it as well. But there's also another line of evidence that suggests that the more you smell something, the more sensitive you might be to its properties. And I think those differences probably depend on the conditions under which you're smelling those things.
Thank you. And thanks, Arthur, for clarifying, for pointing out.
So at this point, we are moving to the general discussion, but it's perfectly fine to ask questions for Asifa as well.
Hello, Asifa. Thank you so much. So you were kind of sketching at the end when you had the slide with the glasses that, maybe seemed like you're gesturing towards maybe there's more effects of language on vision and auditory processing than there are for smell. And I was wondering, given that, with all different types of language and cognition tasks that have been conducted, and how much those tasks can be affected by, the context of a task, and what is the nature of a task in a particular context, do you think it's possible to kind of have a kind of a global account of what types of phenomena there's likely to be effects of language and cognition, beyond just perception? Like, let's just throw in, also emotion and action and object understanding, number, let's just space, let's do all of it. Like, do you think like do you anticipate such a kind of global account by domain?
So I think I did do a little bit of a sleight of hand today, because I think the final smell study doesn't really do the same thing as the other studies. So when talking about color or the sound space associations, those are relying on specific differences in the lexical categories, and then targeting whether those specific lexical distinctions cause differences. I didn't do that, and I haven't really done that in a super convincing way yet for smell, just because we're still figuring out the semantic properties of the smell words that we have in different cultures. So to be able to design a good study that really targets that, you need to know a lot more about the lexical semantics. But whether there's an overarching story, it's a great question. So I've also, been thinking about, is it the case that you're more likely to find effects in more concrete domains versus more abstract domains, for example? But I got myself completely confused now. I don't know whether perceptual phenomena are concrete or abstract anymore. And when that started to break down, then everything's broken down. So I think it's the right kind of question to ask, but I don't have an overarching story to give yet.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Holt. I work with Dave Barner and Judy Fan at UC San Diego. And I have a question, I guess, for sort of all the panelists. And it's about diversity, and it's sort of a methodological one. And it's about diversity over time. So I work with number, and the kinds of number systems that exist in the world are like rapidly decreasing in diversity, as well as like societies that don't use number are just sort of dying out. And the reasons for this are often things like market integration, like actually sort of exchange and trade end up being the sources of number words. And of course, ethically, it's very important that more and more people are actually able to use number in order to survive in like a globalized economy. But importantly, that's a very, very, very recent phenomenon that's changing the sort of structure and scope and like landscape of diversity, and what kinds of diversity we can study. And so I guess my question is like, what other sort of domains that affects, for instance, maybe with syntax, aerial features might look different, and syntactic constructions might reduce in diversity if everyone is bilingual in English and Mandarin and Spanish minimally. And I was sort of wondering what sort of areas of diversity may be most important to prioritize that are rapidly shrinking right now, and to give us a window onto things about human innateness and universality.
Thank you. Maybe that's a question for Jenny.
Sure, I can start, and then maybe Asifa has something to say too. But yeah, I mean, for my research, bilingualism is definitely disruptive, even though obviously it can be a very positive thing. We are generally looking to test populations that don't have exposure to particular types of patterns, and to the degree that English knowledge makes them not really that interesting a population to test anymore, that is a problem. So that's only going to increase over time, and I think what this kind of thing in general just tells us is that we'd better get on it. We'd better get on it now, because I don't think that's something that's necessarily going to stop.
The questions online. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just to add quickly that I think, yeah, absolutely right to point out that globalization and modern technologies are having a huge impact on on what access people have to other communities. But I think we shouldn't forget that colonial histories have a long time, and there's been contact between communities for a long time, and even without the colonial history, there's been contact between different peoples, and yet diversity remains. And I think even though we have these forces of globalization right now, we can also see as many forces for separation as well. So we see nationally across the world places where nationalism is being encouraged. I'm encouraged by the fact that in the European Union, minoritized languages are being given more rights and more learning opportunities. So I think yes, there's an urgency, but I think where there's humans, there's going to be diversity.
Thanks so much. Is there a question online?